All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you again, everyone, for joining our webinar today. This is the State of U.S. Solar Funding and Incentives. And we'll go ahead and first dive in with an agenda of what you can expect to learn today. Oh, we'll go one back here. Here we go. Today what we're going to cover, we're going to start with a little bit about who Cape Fear Solar Systems is. I know many of you know us already, but we'll start there before introducing our special guest, Matt Abel from NCSEA. Then we'll take some time to set the stage in terms of what major policy has led up to the moment that we're in now. We'll then address to the recent changes under the new administration and where that leaves us. Then we'll address a couple of conclusions that we have based on what we know about the certain state of funding, as well as what we expect to happen maybe over the next year or a couple of years, as well as some questions that we might still have. And then lastly, for anyone that sticks around, we'll have some Q&A with Matt Abel as well to finish things off. All right, so getting things started. Many of you, again, already are familiar with who we are. Maybe you've joined one of our webinars before. Maybe this is the first time, though, that you're getting to know us. And so here's a brief summary. We're Cape Fear Solar Systems. We've been in business now since 2007. We're located here in Wilmington, North Carolina, and have done over 4,500 installations in our up to 18 years of business now. We've got over 70 employees, all that operate right here out of our warehouse in downtown Wilmington. We're of course BBB accredited, and lastly, we're community focused. And really what that means is just, this is of course a bigger topic covering the federal level of solar funding and what that means for our industry, but we're also just the experts in local issues in terms of who your utilities are, how they operate with solar, as well as your AHJs, everything that might be required to get a solar system approved and installed to the right standard. So now I'll pass it over to our guest, Matt, to introduce himself, and you can take it away.
Well, great. Thanks, Gabe, to you and the Cape Fear Solar team for having me on this afternoon. And thanks to everybody for tuning in to listen and to stay tuned to some of the updates on what's going on with federal policy and state policy, as there's been a lot over the past 30 or so days. And so I know we all have a lot of different things going on in our lives, so it's really hard to keep track of everything that's going on. And so happy to have the opportunity here with Gabe today to talk a little bit more about how some of those policy changes might impact a decision to install solar on your roof moving forward. I also just appreciate this opportunity to partner with Cape Fear. Cape Fear has been a member of NCSEA dating back to 2009 and has been a very close partner of our organization in upholding sort of what it is that we try to do here in North Carolina and our mission to continue to deploy more clean energy to reduce carbon emissions, to reduce electricity bills, improve affordability, and improve reliability in the state. And Cape Fear has been a great example and a great steward of all of those principles that we carry out as part of our mission here at NCSEA. And also use this opportunity to plug as well. We, as an organization, put together what is known as a solar code of conduct, in which we require all of our installer members that are members of our association to sign and adhere to, ensuring that they are doing what's best by the consumer and installing systems that are living up to what's being promised and are delivering great customer service and continuing to be a great partner of yours throughout your journey in installing solar on your roof. And I'm happy to say that Cape Fear is one of those certified installers on our solar code of conduct. So rest assured, if you do move forward with Cape Fear, that you are working with a great company and are in good hands. So a little bit about what we do at NCSEA. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We're based in Raleigh, but we cover the entire state of North Carolina. And we're first and foremost focused on clean energy policy here in the state. And so we do a lot of work at the General Assembly and at the Utilities Commission, which is the rather obscure regulatory body that oversees a lot of what goes on at utilities across the state. And we have a team of attorneys that are deeply engaged in that work and a team of lobbyists that help to represent organizations like Cape Fear at the General Assembly moving forward so that we can continue to advocate for policies that are ensuring that solar customers are getting the compensation and the benefits that you deserve for moving forward with solar and installing that on your roof. So myself, I've been in this space for about a decade, having worked for a variety of different clean energy nonprofits and for-profits. I'm now our executive director here at the association. And my role really essentially is to be here at events like this to talk about the work that we are doing, help to represent the organization, but really all of the hard work is done by our team of attorneys and analysts that are doing the great work at the Utilities Commission and the General Assembly, as I mentioned earlier. And just broadly speaking, we as an organization represent around 200 businesses and organizations across the state of North Carolina. So lots of installers like Cape Fear. We also represent large businesses. We represent universities, nonprofit organizations who all have a vested interest in deploying more technologies like solar to reduce their utility bills and continue to meet their own sustainability goals as well. So I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be here and talk a little bit more about some of these policy changes. All right. And just as a little bit of background about North Carolina as a whole, I think when I start talking about the clean energy economy here in the state, when I start setting some of these numbers, I think it often catches folks by surprise that North Carolina has actually long been a leader in clean energy technology deployment. And it really comes back to the foundation of what we're talking about here today, which is policy. And North Carolina has long been a proactive leader in implementing bipartisan policy that supports the deployment of clean energy. And that dates back to the early 2000s with things like our Clean Smokestacks Act, then to our Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard that passed in 2007, requiring that our electricity utilities in the state generate a certain portion of their overall electricity through renewable resources, because at that time, legislators and regulators saw the economic benefits of deploying this type of technology on the grid and helping to maintain low electricity rates, in which North Carolina for a long time has maintained some of the lowest electricity rates in the country. And part of that has been through the clean energy technologies that have been deployed to date. And so with some of those proactive policies that we've had on the books here, North Carolina actually leapfrogged all the way up to #2 in installed solar in the country, just behind California. We're now #4 in the country behind Florida and Texas. But as we have gone up that ladder in deploying solar, we've also seen a lot of jobs be created here in the state. We've got more than 109,000 people who work in the clean energy workforce. That includes solar, that includes electric vehicles, that includes battery storage. It also includes things like transmission and distribution and wind and all the different technologies that you would associate with the clean energy ecosystem. We're also a leader in developing these technologies through places like the Research Triangle Park, through places like UNC Charlotte and their engineering schools and NC State's engineering programs. And so while we're a leader in deployment of the technology, while we have a lot of people working in the space, we're also a leader in developing the future of this technology as well, which is really, really exciting. We're #1 in clean tech patents per 1 million residents in the country, which is incredibly exciting to see. And so if we go to the next slide, just to sort of put a finer point on the expanse of the clean energy ecosystem here within the state, our organization conducts an analysis every other year to look at the total economic impact of clean energy. Since 2007, there's been more than $31 billion of direct clean energy investments here in the state, which has led to a total economic impact of nearly $59 billion. And what's great is those economic benefits aren't just exclusive to places like Raleigh and Charlotte and Greensboro. It's all across all 100 counties in the state. North Carolina is actually #1 in the country for rural clean energy jobs. And we see lots and lots of investments in all corners of North Carolina. So this is something that, from an individual perspective, right? Like if you decide to move forward and install solar on your roof, you're helping to continue to support the growth of local businesses like Cape Fear, who are investing in your neighborhood and in your backyard. And we continue to see that all across the state. These are all homegrown businesses that are doing great work supporting our communities. So next slide. The one other piece as it relates to policy, I started talking about North Carolina policy and things like our renewable energy portfolio standard here in the mid 2000s. Well, I'm sure as most folks have probably been tracking, there's been a lot of policy implemented over the past couple of years at the federal level, including the Inflation Reduction Act that passed in 2022, which really helped to spur sort of this next wave of domestic manufacturing of clean energy technologies, of which North Carolina actually was the largest recipient of any state in the country of manufacturing investment announcements across battery storage, solar modules, electric vehicles. And in fact, I'll draw your attention to over in Greenville. There's a company called Boviet Solar who's now going to be manufacturing solar panels right here in North Carolina. Since 2022, North Carolina has seen over $21 billion in announced investments in clean energy manufacturing, the top state in the country. So this has been, policy is really a driver in helping to continue to grow any sector of the economy, right? But we've seen some real significant growth as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act over the past 2 years. So I think that's a good way to set the floor or set the stage for Gabe to cover a little bit more of the ins and outs of the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the provisions within that bill that directly relate to the installation of solar.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that background, Matt. That's really just honestly, when you first shared that with me, that we were #1 in the country in terms of the investment after that, the Inflation Reduction Act, I think that was something that still caught me by surprise. So really cool to hear. And speaking of setting the stage, I'm going to take a moment here before we really dive into kind of where we're at. We really need to take a moment to look at where we're coming from and some of the different programs and what they've looked like policy related. But before I even jump into the weeds, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that because much of what we're going to discuss is rooted in policy, we understand that it is also inherently political. However, for today's discussion, we've decided to focus really on simply educating you on where we're at in terms of these policy, where we may be going due to upcoming policy decisions, and some that have been made, some are still being made. And with that in mind, we also want to acknowledge that there are new developments really by the hour. And so we'll take some time towards the end to acknowledge some of those developments that have occurred even since we began preparing to discuss this topic. So we'll jump right in here. So first and foremost, Matt spoke to this briefly. The Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law by President Joe Biden in 2022. A couple of things came from that, really a lot of things, but some of the highlights are that it extended and expanded the federal ITC, which is the investment tax credit, to 30% through 2032. We'll go through a history here of the ITC in a moment, but prior to the IRA extending and expanding the ITC, it was in the process of sunsetting. So it was decreasing at that time and was on its way out over a period of a couple of years. But it was extended and expanded at 30% through 2032. It also extended tax credit eligibility to standalone energy storage. So prior to the IRA, it was sort of unclear whether or not you were able to claim a tax credit for a standalone battery storage installation at your home. That was cleared up, and certainly any ambiguity no longer existed. It also introduced programs like Solar for All, which we'll touch more on here in a moment, and introduced the domestic content adder for commercial projects. And that's definitely worth mentioning here because it's also just a factor that's influenced a lot of that investment that Matt mentioned. So a lot of the manufacturing that's come in to our state and other nearby states, the Southeast as a whole has seen a lot of this investment. is a byproduct of that domestic content adder, which is a 10% additional incentive that commercial projects can receive if they incorporate a certain amount of domestic material. And so jumping down here to Solar for All, this was a part of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund within the IRA. It was designed to expand access to solar and reduce electricity costs for low-income families. And it takes shape through state-selected solar rebates, low-interest financing, and other programs. And so much of how that funding gets released ultimately is down to the states, but the money is to go from the federal level to the state to be able to distribute that and determine the best way for it to be utilized. And then next is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So this was signed into law by President Joe Biden in 2021. It provided for an additional $1.2 trillion in funding for infrastructure improvements focused on transportation, broadband, and energy. And it funded grant and loan programs advancing clean energy research and deployment. So that was just another factor that really led to a lot of the research and development of some of these products over a period of a couple of years. So we'll jump to the next slide here. And so this is just to provide a little bit more history of the ITC. And again, that's the Federal Investment Tax Credit. And so this incentive, which allows for 30% of the system costs to be claimed directly against your federal tax liability. This was introduced in 2006 at that 30% under the Energy Policy Act of 2005. And it was then extended at 30% in 2008 for 8 years under the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act. So we can see here that there's sort of a trend of these extensions from one season to another in our history, but the multi-year extension and phase down plan was introduced in 2015. And that allowed for an extension at 30% until 2019, a decrease to 26% in 2020, another decrease to 22% in 2021 before expiring in 2022. Now it would have provided for a 10% incentive to remain for commercial for a period of years, but for residential purposes, it was going to be expired at that time. It was extended again at 26% for 2021 in the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which was signed by President Donald Trump. And then the Inflation Reduction Act most recently restored it back to 30% through 2032 before introducing a step down in expiration in 2035. So you can see here in the graph on the right that really depicts where we're at in this current story of the ITC. And we can see, we've got a pretty long runway right now, as is currently laid out within the IRA. But of course, we'll get to here in a moment some of the concern people might have around that over the greater future. And I'll jump to our next slide here. And that brings us really to where we're currently at. So this speaks to the new administration coming in, and a number of executive orders were kind of brought across. And the main one is the Unleashing American Energy, was the executive order. And it was signed on January 20th, 2025, so this year. And it issues an immediate pause on all disbursement of federal funds appropriated through the IRA and the IIJA that conflict with the principles in the new policy. And really the policy, some of you may have heard, drill baby drill, but a lot of the policy was focused on really trying to take away some of the incentives around some of these different clean energy things and allow the marketplace, as he would argue, to just determine what was going to be best suited for people to take advantage of. And so that allowed for a funding pause that then was immediately brought down over federal agencies such as the EPA and the Department of Energy, and states that had already been awarded funds from programs like Solar for All and other grants were actually unable to access it. So that brought about a lot of uncertainty, right, around certain programs like Solar for All specifically and others that might have come from the IRA, and whether or not those were going to continue to be available. Now, as of February 25th, and we actually have some maybe more recent updates than this that we'll talk about in a moment, programs such as Solar for All, the Clean Energy, the Clean School Bus Program, and the Climate Pollution Grants had regained access. Others, though, such as the Department of Agriculture's Rural Energy for America program, remained on hold. So those were just some of the programs that, for a period at least, had been paused, and then much of the larger solar programs, as in Solar for All, were restored. That being said, the one thing that this doesn't speak to is the federal tax credit, which of course is not a program per se. It's policy in terms of tax law, but that's something that would be sort of outside these funding clauses. However, it doesn't take away from the concern that people have about the future of those incentives, and we'll make some conclusions to that effect here in a moment. I'm curious, Matt, if you have any thoughts specifically that you'd like to add in time, sort of that rundown as it pertains to the history of some of these programs, or even some of the recent developments.
Sure. Yeah, I think to go back really quickly to Solar for All, I think that's a program that a lot of folks in this space have been incredibly excited about, given the amount of funding available through the program itself. So North Carolina actually received a grant of $156 million for our Solar for All program here within the state. And based on some, earlier initial projections that I had seen, that type of funding or investment could essentially double the total capacity of residential solar that we currently have in the market within the next 5 years moving forward. So, this is a really significant amount of funding to support residential systems in the state. And good news that Gabe, mentioned is that these funds appear to be unfrozen, and things seem to be moving forward at this moment. And right now, where that all stands is North Carolina applied for those funds as part of a coalition that consisted of the State Energy Office, which is under the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, the North Carolina Clean Energy Fund, which is essentially North Carolina's green bank, the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center, and Advanced Energy. And so where we are in the roadmap, that award notice was given last year, I believe late spring, early summer. And the intent behind that roadmap now is they're starting to do all of the due diligence to figure out exactly how those funds will get dispersed, what types of programs, what installers, whom will have access to those funds. And the idea is that those funds will be available and will start being dispersed within the state pending any other changes, either later this year or earlier next year. But again, we don't know the specifics on what that looks like. And based on what we've seen in other states, and I think what might happen here too, is there'll be some sort of income qualified programs, because most of the funds are intended to be directed towards low to moderate income households within the state. So still to be determined how exactly that plays out, but still exciting that we have that funding available in the state nonetheless. And yeah, exactly as Gabe mentioned, these things are changing on a daily basis. 3 weeks ago, the story around some of these funding programs was totally different than what it is now. But I think as we have seen this start to play out more, and the courts really falling on the side of Congress having the power of the purse, it would take legislative action to start either rescinding some of these funds or pausing these programs. And we'll talk about, I'm sure, in a little bit about things like the ITC and EV tax credits that may be in the crosshairs of Congress in future legislation. But I don't want to jump the gun and get to that before we might cover that. So yeah, those are just some quick thoughts from that, Gabe.
Cool. Yeah, I appreciate that insight. It's interesting you mentioned the North Carolina Clean Energy Fund. We actually have had the opportunity to work with them over the last several months to bring their lending options to a number of our customers, lower to moderate income or otherwise. And it's been impressive to see how that's been, a creative tool to help make these types of solutions more affordable for our customers. And I'm very excited for them as an organization and what that funding might do for their goals. So Cool. Well, we will go ahead and jump ahead here. I know we've spoken a lot about some federal funding and different programs. Something we haven't really addressed is something going on in our backyard that isn't really impacted by this policy, but is very relevant to the bigger picture of incentives and other things that are available. And I think an important part of the picture. So I'll pass it back over to Matt and let him speak more about PowerPair.
Sure. Yeah, and if you haven't yet had a chance to hear about PowerPair, I'm sure there's probably a lot of materials on Cape Fear's website about this program, as it is a really, really great opportunity to um, help offset some of the cost of installing a system, and to provide a little bit of context around this program. We're talking a lot about what's happening at the federal level as it relates to policy. This is sort of in a totally different lane, as this Power Pair program was authorized by the North Carolina Utilities Commission just a couple of years ago. I'll preface by saying that this program is a pilot program. And so what I mean by pilot program is that there is a limited capacity available in Duke Energy Progress territory and Duke Energy Carolinas territory. And where we stand towards meeting that capacity is in Duke Progress. There's about half of the initial capacity remaining moving forward. So I'll get to my point around that here in just a minute, about now being a great time to install, given this incentive that is currently available. But the gist of the incentive is the utility will provide a rebate for a customer that decides to install a new solar and battery system to the tune of 36 cents a watt, and also $400 a kilowatt hour for battery storage. And so, depending on the equipment that you install and the total amount of modules or solar panels that you install on your house, you could be eligible for up to $9,000 as part of an upfront rebate from the utility. And I do a lot of work with similar organizations to an NCSEA in states all across the country. And I bring this program up to those organizations. And usually when I bring this program up, jaws hit the floor, because North Carolina is very unlike a lot of other states. I don't know many other states, or really any other state, that has a program similar to this. And oftentimes this is seen as one of the best incentive programs in the country for solar and battery storage. And the best part about this too is the incentive is not exclusive to the upfront installation costs. Should you decide to also allow the utility to discharge your battery during certain periods of time a year, where the grid might become strained because it might be a cold winter morning where everybody is running heat at their home and we're reaching capacity via the existing grid infrastructure, the utility might want to be able to utilize batteries to help offset that peak need. And so if you enroll in the utilities battery program, you can be incentivized at $6.50 a kilowatt per month on an ongoing basis beyond that initial $9,000 upfront incentive. So I'd encourage you, if you are considering installing at your home, to talk to the Cape Fear team about what the specifics of that rebate look like upfront based on the equipment and the system that you're looking to install at your house, and what that incentive could look like on an ongoing basis. I will say that ongoing incentive is not an insignificant number when you add up the total size of the battery that you might be installing at your home. For example, I show a picture here of a Tesla Powerwall. That Tesla Powerwall is available for that maximum incentive at that 13.5 kilowatt hour. So it's a really, really exciting time to install in North Carolina right now. But getting back to that point from the beginning, it is a pilot program. And once we hit that stated capacity, the pilot program will be no more. However, that doesn't mean there may not be some future iteration of the program that may be available for a longer period of time. However, I don't have a crystal ball and I can't predict the future. And I also can't predict what the Utilities Commission is going to do moving forward. So If this is a program that is of interest, I would highly recommend considering getting in on it now before that program has been fully consumed. So beyond the Power Pair program itself, there are a number of other incentives that are out there, even outside of the scope of just solar and battery storage. And this goes back to the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a bill that basically authorized $369 billion towards the clean energy transition. And so there are a variety of different programs that are focused on encouraging the transition to electric appliances in your home. And so things like heat pumps, things like heat pump water heaters, energy efficiency upgrades for your homes. Most of those things are eligible for tax credits available through the federal government. Navigating that ecosystem of incentives can oftentimes be incredibly difficult. So there are a number of resources that have been put together to help folks figure out what is available to them. The one that I often point to is Rewiring America, their IRA savings calculator. It's a great way for you to go on there, type in your zip code, put in your details about your situation at your home, and they can help identify all of the rebates and incentives that are available to you. And a couple of other programs and resources that I put on this page as well include a website called Energy Funds for All, which is a little bit more North Carolina centric to help you identify some of those incentives. There's a tool called Database of State Incentives for Renewables and Efficiency, otherwise known as Desire. And then, of course, I always recommend folks take a look at their utility provider, who oftentimes has a number of different incentive programs available for you should you be in the process of. Again, we talked about Power Pair, which is a program available through Duke. But if you decide you want to change out your water heater in your home, or your HVAC system, or you want to install an EV charger, there are usually a number of different programs available through the utility to help offset some of those upfront costs. So here are a couple of great resources to help navigate what those incentives look like should you decide to make any of those investments moving forward. So Gabe, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I know one of the big ones that we've seen really hundreds of homeowners take advantage of over the last couple of years has been the EV charger prep credit through Duke Energy. And even many of your smaller co-ops nowadays we're finding have some sort of program in place to help homeowners add EV chargers, level 2 EV chargers at their home. So definitely something important to be aware of. So with that all in mind, I think we really come to a couple of conclusions and potential questions as well. But really, we'll touch on these and then we'll jump into our Q&A. The first is just that the federal tax credit isn't going anywhere for 2025, but 2026 and beyond can certainly be much murkier. And so, we identified that tax credit isn't impacted by the battle over freezing funds distributed by government agencies such as the DOE or EPA. That being said, Matt also alluded to that it's going to take, legislative action for something like that to change. And it's not unlikely for them to ultimately kind of tackle like what's on the chopping block if they're to start sort of reopen IRA and what portions of it are to continue. President Trump's priority is centered around EV credits and other programs ultimately. But a revision to the existing extension of the federal ITC isn't unlikely. And so that could look like a number of different things. We'll talk about that in a moment. Second is just EV tax credits, in a lot of ways appear to be maybe on the chopping block. That's one of the main things that Trump continues to kind of bring the hammer down on, is that that's not necessary. You can also speculate, with his affiliation with Elon, that Elon in many ways might benefit even from EV tax credits going away, as it might levelize the market in some ways. That's something people have speculated. But he's been pretty clear about that, and that's just something that I think we have to be aware of. Three programs such as Solar for All are in for a fight. It seems like the battle's being won right now in terms of the states receiving funding and that moving forward. So that's great. A full repeal of the IRA is unlikely, thanks to essentially bipartisan support and significant economic impact in line for red districts. One of the things that I think is just so impressive is that these manufacturing facilities for these products, this domestic product, are a lot of times in rural areas, areas that have benefited from huge economic growth, huge job opportunities in those regions. And that's something that just continues to have bipartisan support. And then also President Trump's executive order and the pausing and resuming of funds appears to have just muddied the water around the SFA, but that was honestly something that was put in here before we had some of the good news that we've received recently. So it does seem like that's trending in the right direction. And then moving on here, a couple more conclusions. For us, just that material costs are at historical lows are likely to increase over the next 6 to 12 months as domestic manufacturing continues to be prioritized. And so we've actually started to see some of this as distributors talk to us about what prices might look like in 3 months or 6 months from now. Tariffs have already begun to impact the demand for domestic products. So what happens is while some manufacturers like or installers such as ourselves might be using largely domestic content, what happens is when the rest of the market shifts from using different materials to that domestic product, the demand for it is going to skyrocket. And in all likelihood, we'll find that that increases the cost of that material. And the other factor at play here, and something we're hearing from a lot of people, is just that revisions to the ITC could center around domestic content requirements. So we mentioned before that the ITC has an adder for domestic content for commercial projects. That doesn't apply to residential projects. However, it's been discussed that in revising the tax credit under the IRA and a revision of the IRA, it's being considered that they might make domestic content a requirement in order to get the tax credit at all. So that's something, who knows where that goes, but that would certainly shift pricing of material as well. And then 5 is combining the federal ITC with programs such as Duke Energy's Power Pair Incentive that Matt just touched on, really have made the last year and what we believe to be the next 6 to 10 months the best time to go solar that we may see for many years. We're certainly optimistic still about developments to the technology, new efficiencies that happen, and very hopeful about the impact that organizations like NCSEA and otherwise can have on policy as well, and what that's going to do for making this affordable for homeowners for years to come. But even as good as it might look in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years from now, it's very hard to believe that all of these sort of pieces are going to fall into place quite like they have right now. And so we'll see what that looks like, but that's certainly something that we want people to be aware of as some of those headwinds come down. All right, and so that's our conclusions there. I do want to just take a moment again to thank Matt so much for joining us today. It really was a pleasure to kind of dive into the weeds of all this policy and again this changing environment, this changing storm that we're in. It really was great to have your insight, so I appreciate that again.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on. And as you'll see here on the screen, my contact information is right there. So I'd encourage you. I know the Cape Fear team probably can answer all of the questions that you might have quicker than I could, but I'm happy to be a resource as much as I can be, or find some folks either at my team or elsewhere to help answer any questions that you might have. And 2 other points I wanted to go back to, Gabe, that you were just talking about on some of the previous slides, right? Talking about the IRA in general and where those investments have gone. There's been some analysis that have shown that 85% of the total investments, manufacturing investments that have been made as a result of the IRA have happened within Republican districts across the country. So this is something that is supported folks all over the U.S., but particularly the Southeast has seen an outsized proportion of the benefits and manufacturing announcements, which is just incredible. And then to the point around the EV tax credit, I think that is probably the tax credit that is going to be first on the potential chopping block. And some of the latest proposals that have been floated around on that front are completely eliminating the $7,500 and I believe it's $4,500 tax credit for used EVs. And in the case of new electric vehicles, instating a one-time upfront $5,000 tax on the purchase of that vehicle. That's the latest proposal, again, subject to change based on conversations that happen on an hourly basis. And then I think just more broadly as it relates to the IRA, the latest that we're hearing from many of our partners that are on Capitol Hill and talking to congressional offices is the approach to the bill itself is to probably take a scalpel to certain provisions within the bill versus taking a sledgehammer and trying to completely repeal or eliminate the bill. And so, like we were talking about, EV tax credit being one of the items that will probably be on the priority list. There are growing concerns about the solar, ITC tax credits as well. But as Gabe mentioned, right, like those things take time. And so we do still have those tax credits in place now. And it's not going to be a retroactive sort of repeal, right? So I think you can rest assured, feel comfortable that if you decide to move forward with projects now, that those tax credits are still going to be available and Power Pair program is still available. So now is a great time to consider moving forward before any changes might happen in the future.
Thanks, Matt. Really appreciate your insight there. And yeah, I've heard the analogy, the scalpel instead of the sledgehammer as well. It seems like that's the approach that they're wanting to take, which I think is wise. If they're wanting to make changes, I think on both sides of the table, they seem to recognize the many advantages that we've seen, even in the brief period since the IRA started. Well, cool. We'll go ahead and we'll jump into Q&A here. I see a couple questions have started to come in. We'll get started here with a few, Matt, that we have for you. The first being, what are the biggest challenges or opportunities that you foresee for solar moving forward in North Carolina?
Yeah, I think opportunities being North Carolina. I mentioned earlier on that North Carolina has historically seen some of the lowest electric utility rates in the country. That's changing. And I'm sure as folks on the call have seen over the past year and a half, we've seen some pretty significant rate increases all across the board, all across customer classes in the state. And in fact, North Carolina has seen some of the largest electricity rate increases of any state in the country over the past year and a half. And folks ask, well, why is that the case? And there have been some analyses done by many of our partners that show fuel cost volatility has been a large reason why electric utility rates have gone up. And when I talk about fuel cost volatility, North Carolina and our electricity grid right now, a lot of it is largely dependent on natural gas, and natural gas pricing has swung pretty rapidly up and down as a result of geopolitics, and that has hit the ratepayer pretty hard. And for our rate increases that we've seen over the past year, about 70% of those rate increases are due to that natural gas fuel volatility. And so, I think when you're looking out ahead, the cost of doing business as a utility is only going to continue to go up. The cost of fuel costs are going to continue to go up. We're seeing more and more storms come in through the region. Look at Helene in Western North Carolina. Eastern North Carolina has seen more than your fair share of hurricanes that have come through the region, requiring utilities to rebuild all that infrastructure. Who pays to rebuild all that infrastructure? The ratepayers, right? So utility rates are going to continue to go up. And I think in an era where we're seeing sort of a high inflationary type environment and also seeing more frequent and severe storms, solar is a great way to insulate yourself against some of those future rate increases. And also a great way to help keep the lights on when you see some of those storms come throughout the region. And so I say, for example, in Western North Carolina, post Helene, our organization and also the state have invested pretty heavily in deploying solar and battery storage, the same type of equipment that we're talking about here, to help residents in that part of the state recover from the storm and help them be more prepared for the next time a storm comes through the region, right? So this is not just about reducing emissions. This is about keeping utility bills low and keeping the lights on for folks when we have these storms come through the region. And it's also about saving lives too. We've seen in some instances in Western North Carolina, there have been very vulnerable residents out there that depend on medical devices, oxygen tanks, et cetera, that don't work without power. And some of the solar and battery storage systems that we've been deploying out there have helped to keep those devices on for people who need them. So I think that's a really big opportunity for us. I also, as we talk about the volatility of what's going on at the federal level, in North Carolina, I think is a really interesting state in general. We've got a Democratic governor, we've got a Republican majority in the legislature, and yet we've still seen really great proactive clean energy policy pass in the state, dating back to even 3 years ago with House Bill 951, which established carbon emissions reduction mandates for our electricity grid here in the state. And that was done in a bipartisan manner between Governor Cooper and Republican leadership. And so I think as we continue to have conversations with elected officials at the General Assembly, they have an appetite to figure out what's next. How can we encourage more of these technologies to be deployed in the state so that we can continue to help our constituents save money on their utility bills when we know that they're continuing to go up? So those are some of the biggest opportunities that I foresee. Challenges, right, are, I think anytime there's uncertainty, that presents a challenge, especially from a long-term investment standpoint. If you as a business are thinking about installing solar 2 or 3 years down the road, right? We don't necessarily know where we might be 3 or 4 years down the road as it relates to some of these provisions within the IRA that we talk about, right? Hence, again, why now is a great time to be considering installing, because we have the uncertainty in this moment right now around things like the Power Pair program, around the ITC. And so I think just the biggest challenge is kind of looking out further down the road is uncertainty. And certainty, right, just in general helps any sort of business project where they're going to be investing and where they're going to be going moving forward. So those are some of the biggest challenges that I foresee.
Cool, I appreciate that. So a couple well, I'll jump into a couple questions here from our attendees. So one of them, maybe you have insight into this, maybe you don't, but are you aware if REAP still has applications for farmers available until the end of March?
Yes, I saw that question come in and I was double checking on that. So REAP grant applications are still open. They are taking applications. However, what I'm hearing is that the program has been paused and there's been very little communication between REAP applicants and awardees and USDA about the status of those funds. So I think there is some uncertainty around the program itself. But if the past couple of weeks have been any indication, there's been a lack of communication around some of these other funding programs. And then I think as we continue to move forward, the communication opens back up and some of the funding continues to be released. So I would say, given the fact that the application portal is still open, I would encourage folks to take advantage of that and put in applications with the hope that communication opens back up and funding continues to flow.
Cool, thanks, Matt. That's helpful insight. I'll pass this one to either Dar or John here. So the question is Power Pair only available to Duke customers? I can answer that. This is a Duke Energy program, but the question then is asking for a customer on South River EMC. So curious if you can provide any insight into what it looks like to work with solar on South River, if either of you. I know we've done some projects there and have become familiar, but I also know I'm putting you on the spot. You may not know off the top of your head.
Yeah, I'll take this, Gabe. So yeah, power pair, Duke Energy only, Duke Energy Progress in Carolinas. With that being said, South River EMC is one of the few co-ops in North Carolina that has one-to-one net metering. So it's actually a pretty favorable structure for solar. So if you haven't looked into it for your house, I would recommend, reaching out to us and seeing what the proposition would look like. Because they are pretty favorable for solar.
Thanks, Jan. That's helpful. Next question here from Keith. Joined late, but is Cape Fear Solar involved in Energize NC yet? That's a bit of a complicated question, I guess. I don't really know that anybody is involved with Energize NC quite yet, right? But I think we're keeping in touch with their communication. We got their emails today, for example, to let everyone know that they had gotten access to the Solar for All funding, and we're kind of waiting along with everyone else to see how those programs are going to be rolled out. I don't know if you can touch any more on that, Matt.
Yeah, I was just talking with some of the organizers of that program yesterday, in which they are intending to start organizing some stakeholder meetings that will include residential solar installers in Cape Fear as well here within the next few weeks and months to work directly with the installers to make sure that we're setting up the program in a way that truly meets the needs of customers. And also is setting up the program in a way that good, reputable North Carolina companies are participating in the program, and that it works well for just homeowners across the state. So that will be kicking off here shortly, and I'm sure Cape Fear will be working very closely with their team to develop all that criteria.
Cool. Thanks, Matt. Next question here, and I'll provide maybe a little bit of background. Says, I believe the IRA included availability to nonprofits of 30% reimbursement of solar system install costs. So that's a sort of essentially like was a program that was put into place because nonprofits couldn't claim the tax credit because they didn't pay taxes, that they would be able to benefit from an incentive. Do you anticipate any retroactive cancellation of that feature of the legislation? And I think that's specifically to ask, is there any reason to worry about a system that was installed in 24 or 25?
I mean, I can speculate on this, and my speculation would say likely not. I really would be shocked if there was any sort of legislation that retroactively attempted to claw back any of these tax credits. I haven't ever seen an instance like that around tax credits, either at the state level, and some folks might remember North Carolina had state level tax credits through about 2015. There was a short attempt to try to call back some of those tax credits that didn't go anywhere. I don't think you're going to see anything like that via legislation to retroactively try to claw back tax credits.
Yeah, and I think maybe the point there too is just that it's not in anybody's interest for that to be what happens here, right? I think there can be a difference of opinion around the policy of some of these things within the IRA. But as same goes for certain elements of the domestic content and the investment in the manufacturing and these things, is like nobody really wants for all of that investment to have been for no cause, right? Especially when it's to benefit the greater economies of all of these states that these legislators ultimately are answering to. So I think yeah, well answered, Matt. Next question here, and maybe I'm not sure, Matt, I'm not as familiar with the question, if this was something you're reading up on. Any news or updates on release of EECBG funding? I'm not as familiar with what that might be referring to.
If I'm not mistaken, if that might be the homes and HERES funding that folks might be referring to, energy efficiency and conservation block grant funding. And feel free to correct me in the questions or comments if I'm misunderstanding or misrepresenting the programs. But there is now new funding that is available through the state of North Carolina, through Department of Environmental Quality and the State Energy Office, called Homes and Here's funding, which is directed towards energy efficiency and electrification incentives in the state and directed towards low to moderate income households. That program is actually rolling out now. They just started that program, and folks can apply for that funding and check eligibility status via the Department of Environmental Quality website, and I'll drop a link in the chat right now. So it seems like everything is moving forward with that as we speak.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Well, it looks like that's all we have for now. So I just want to take a moment for those of you who are homeowners that have already installed solar with us on your home. Thank you as always for continuing to be a part of our solar community and staying in touch with the different things in our industry, and our efforts that are changing, and obviously just being a part of our community. We're so appreciative of that. For those of you who are considering solar or just starting to explore solar, if there are any questions that you have after this webinar or are curious about going through the process of evaluating solar for your home, please do just reach out. Dar and John are great experts in terms of what it looks like to go solar here in our community. And so we'd love to schedule time for them to chat with you. You can reach us at info@capefearsolarsystems.com. You're also welcome to email me directly, and I'm happy to reach out to folks as well. My email is gabe@capefearsolarsystems.com. All right, folks. Thanks so much again. Matt, thanks so much for being with us. And for the rest of y'all, I hope you have a good night.